So today I'm going to focus on the lives of three women who lived, worked and raised their families in London in the second half of the 17th century. So the boundaries of that on this very old, sort of slightly faded map go from the Tower of London in the east all the way around to Temple Bar in the west. So in this period, as it still is today, the city was governed by the Corporation of London, a municipal body that was run by the annually elected Lord Mayor, the Court of Aldermen and the Common Council. The city heavily regulated traders and required them to be freemen to practice their trade. But the city's customary laws allowed women to formally continue running their husband's business after his death, though most of them would have been involved in the business during his lifetime anyway. So to situate ourselves, for those who are not familiar with the period, the second half of the 17th century was a really turbulent time for the city. That's what makes it so interesting to research. So it witnessed the end of the civil wars and the return of Charles II as king in 1660. The Great Fire of 1666 destroyed 4/5 of the city, including a lot of the parish churches, and displaced thousands of citizens, many who were living in camps up in Moorfield, which is just here. The subsequent rebuilding programs of trying to rebuild swathes of the city was incredibly costly, and it cost the city a lot of money. A lot of its income had been in rents in the city itself. Obviously, when a lot of those houses and properties burnt down, it did struggle financially. And then to kind of make all of this much worse, in 1683, the city had its quo warranto taken away by the king, so the sort of charter to practice as it was supposed to. In that same year, it started a financial crisis, which lasted for 11 years and was only solved when an Act of Parliament was passed in 1694, where essentially the government had to bail them out from falling into bankruptcy. So the city's population was also rapidly growing in this period. So inside the city walls, the population grew from 40,000 in 1550 to about 70,000 in 1631, and it continued to grow throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. As with rapid population growth and increased urbanization, mortality rates in the city also rapidly grew, and the high number of deaths were recorded on the weekly bills of mortality, which some of you may have seen. The high rate of mortality in the city not only impacted infants, many of whom would not make it past the age of 5, but also families who suffered the loss of either a mother or a father. Losing a father or husband could be a desperate situation for many families, as it could lead to financial instability for both his widow and his children. Indeed, widowhood was a really precarious stage of the life cycle for women. While for wealthy and propertied women, widowhood could offer relative freedom and prosperity outside of the sort of bounds of marriage. For those without means, widowhood often meant a loss of income and labour contribution to the household, and required many women to provide for their children as single parents. Widowhood also brought legal burdens. Widows were more likely to be involved in litigation in the first year of their widowhood than in any other time during that stage, as they often had to settle their husband's estates, paid off his debts, dealt with his creditors, and ensured their children were provided for. This new legal status brought considerable administrative burdens alongside the trauma of losing a spouse. For many widows of the mercantile class, they had little choice but to carry on the family business, taking on extra labour or apprentices where needed to ensure a steady income and to provide for their children. So this is where the Court of Orphans comes in. So the Court of Orphans was run by the City of London and was established to curtail the negative impacts of losing a father and to remedy the broken family. The court has some of its origins as early as the 1200s. I think the first instance of the court intervening on a child is in 1250-something. So use of the court was one of the privileges that came with being a citizen of the city, and it ensured that if a freeman died, his estate was divided amongst his widow and children, and that his orphans were appropriately looked after during their minority. So you had to be a freeman of the city in order for your estate to be processed by the court. So the City of London, in effect, fulfilled the patriarchal role of father for thousands of orphans, obviously alongside the mothers who were often doing the more kind of day-to-day care of these orphans. And they ensured the children of the city's mercantile class would prosper and become active members of the city's business community when they grew up. I think at the heart of the court is a general anxiety that the business class of the sort of mercantile class of London, some of the children might kind of slip through and maybe end up in servitude or in positions they weren't supposed to. So, and also an anxiety that, you know, if you were running the court, your own children might someday be left as orphans. So there's a real kind of encouragement to kind of make sure these children are provided for, because, you know, people didn't know if that was going to be their children tomorrow. So as I said, most of the research I'll be discussing today I've taken from my PhD, which I finished last year, which looked specifically at the role of women in the court of orphans in the 17th and 18th centuries. Nearly all the research for this was done here at the London Archives, but I heavily relied on parish registers and Freeman admission papers, which are on Ancestry, which was a blessing during COVID when I couldn't come into the archive, and the records of the London Livery Companies online, which is colloquially known as Rollco. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the kind of inner workings of the Court of Orphans, but I'm just going to briefly discuss how it worked, because it might provide a little bit of context for the rest of the talk. So I'll leave any kind of methodologies or stuff to the end, which I'm happy to answer questions on. So I just want to focus today really on sort of the stories that came out of some of this research, and kind of what this tells us about being a widow, being a mother, and being a businesswoman in the 17th century in London. So this rather exciting graph, which I lovingly made myself, makes the court look sort of far scarier than it actually is. It's a fairly straightforward process. Bits of the process could obviously break down, but most estates followed this process. So it all started with the death of a freeman with a child under the age of 21. So these obviously children could be, some of them were actually born after their fathers passed away if the mother was still pregnant when he died. Or they could go up to being 20 years of age. Sometimes it could be one orphan, sometimes it could be 7 or 8 the court was having to provide for. So in the first instance, that death would be reported to the Guildhall, and then the Guildhall would then start to intervene. His executor of his estate, or the administrator, if he hadn't left a will, would then be tasked with providing an inventory. So that's where appraisers were appointed, and they have to go through his entire house and potentially also his shops as well. And make sure that everything was accounted for. So it could be money, it could be clothes, it could be furniture, all that kind of stuff. Real estate is removed from this, it's just kind of the physical things that he owned. So when the inventory was compiled, which was done on vellum in these really tight rolls, and sometimes they're absolutely massive depending on the wealth of the person, the estate was then divided by someone called the Common Sergeant, who was an official in the Guildhall that oversaw a lot of the Court of Orphans business. So the estate was then divided into thirds. So you had the widow's portion, which obviously went to the widow if he left one. You had the orphan's portion, which was divided between any of the orphans. And then you have the bequests that he laid out in his will. So that might be things he left to his family, money he's left to charity, to his parish, neighbours, family, things like that. And this was affectionately known as the dead man's portion. Obviously, if a citizen died without any orphans, it would just be halved between the will and his widow, and obviously, yeah, it would be done according to if he was married, had children. So the executor then had 2 options with the estate. So they could either deposit the money, so that the money that was owed to the orphans from the estate, they could either deposit that money into the City of London's chamber, so essentially the financial department. They could essentially give that money to the city on loan, and then in return for that, they could claim interest known as finding money. That finding money could be collected every quarter, every 6 months, every year, whatever was convenient. And then that finding money could be used to maintain the orphan. So they would be looking after the orphan and using that money to provide for them for food, schooling, board, things like that. Or the second option was they could keep the money themselves. So if the child was perhaps 3 years of age, and they knew the child obviously wasn't going to reach maturity until they were 21, they're going to have quite a long amount of time to kind of use that money. So you might hold that money, invest it, try and make some interest off it, and then when the child became of age, so at 21 or 18, if a female orphan was married, they then obviously had to give that money back to the orphan. Obviously, 2 distinct choices, often depended on the age of the children, the number of children, the kind of financial needs. Some people just needed to have that money. So they would choose to hold it rather than put it in the city's chamber. I think it's also important to state this is before the Bank of England is founded, which was founded in 1694. So the city was kind of offering some of the only kind of financial means to invest money and make interest off it at the time.
Can I have a tiny question? What security did the city provide around the executor? What if he took the money and fled the country?
So yeah.
Repeating that question to people at home.
Yeah, so the question was about kind of security and what sort of security that the city were providing, obviously to make sure that people weren't kind of absconding with a child's money. So when you came in and you were the recognitor, so you were the person physically holding the money, you had to bring at least two sureties, essentially guarantors who would sign for the money with you. And that was for often quite an inflated amount on the original sort of capital. So if the capital was, say, 150, they might be being held to that to about 175, 200 pounds. So obviously they were then owing a considerable sum of money if they didn't pay it back. So it was largely just financial. It was quite a big financial kind of punishment if you didn't do that. And then some of the other sort of punishments within the court. So if you married an orphan, say you married a 17-year-old orphan without permission, you'd be sent to Newgate jail and heavily fined. So it's fairly harsh punishments, but they rarely needed to use them, to be fair. But yeah, it was largely financial. So this whole kind of process comes to an end when the orphan reaches 21. As I said, female orphans could claim their inheritance if they were married and 18. So you do often see an orphan who's maybe 19 or 20, her husband's coming into the court to collect his wife's inheritance. Obviously it would have gone to him as part of kind of marriage arrangements, and then the court officially acknowledged them as satisfied. So they could either come into the court and claim that money themselves as well. The court would say, I judge you to be of age, or if sometimes they could bring their parents or their mother with them and say, my mother says that I'm 21, I can collect my money. So they were acknowledged as satisfied, and in theory they sort of left the court's jurisdiction. But obviously as kind of reality, everything's a bit more complicated, and you do see some of the orphans coming back at later stages, specifically young orphans who are maybe 23, 24, have become married and then they've become widowed, and they've kind of gone back to this institution that provided for them as children to kind of provide maybe relief or a bit of money if they kind of fall on harder times later in life. So yeah, it looks very complicated, but most estates kind of move through this process fairly easily. So the first widow that I'm going to talk about today is a widow named Prudence Wood. So Prudence was the widow of Thomas Wood, who died in or around 1669. As her husband died without making a will, Prudence Wood was issued with letters of administration in April 1669, which allowed her to obviously administrate her husband's estate in lieu of a will where he would have appointed an executor. So Jesse probably died quite suddenly if he hadn't made a will. So she was responsible for bringing the probate inventory to the Court of Orphans, sort of listing all of the things that he owned, which she did in January 1670. And then 3 years later, in May 1673, she brought a probate account. This is often because it took people so long to call in these debts. It would take them multiple years to settle the estate, call in all of the debts. So yeah, she came in with the probate account with considerably more money 3 years later. As I mentioned earlier, death left bureaucratic burdens on women. Though Thomas Wood had come to London from Ludlow in Shropshire as an apprentice to a fishmonger in 1629, and he's named as a fishmonger on his inventory, this does not appear to have been his primary trade when he died. So looking in his probate inventory and looking at the warehouse he had, you can see it's full of silks, satins, coifs, scarves, purses, all which was valued to about £500, which is obviously quite a considerable amount of money to have just in sort of stock items in the warehouse. Similarly, the dozens of debts listed as owing to him note both the name of the debtors and unusually where the debtors lived. So he must have kept incredibly detailed accounts, which the appraisers of his estate were able to kind of use when compiling the inventory. So the debtors listed come from all across the British Isles, from Antrim, Dublin, Bristol, Hull, Gloucester, Ludlow, where he was from, and Abergavenny. So by looking at this, it seems that Thomas Wood was making his living as a milliner. So in this period, milliners are not just making hats, but they're kind of making ready-to-wear, sort of pre-made material and items of clothing. And obviously was doing trade with merchants from Ireland, England, and Wales. So Prudence Wood was either running the business with her husband and continued to do so when he died, or she took over it after his death. As our inventory also lists a warehouse with an accompanying shop containing a parcel of silk and made wares. It seems likely that the shop was acquired during Prudence's widowhood. He doesn't have a shop on his inventory, just a warehouse. It's not listed on her husband's inventory. She certainly moved house after her husband died, as the address that she gave to Guildhall in January 1670 when she came to the court is in Pilkington Court, which is off Little Britain, which is obviously where the Old Museum of London site is now. As her inventory shows, her house was smaller than the one listed on her husband, so she moved and downsized during her widowhood, but also acquired a shop. She stated her parish as St Lawrence Jewry in her will, which is east of Little Britain inside the city walls, and had the lease of a house on nearby Lad Lane. So yeah, it's possible that she moved to a dwelling house with an adjoining shop during the time that she was a widow. She continued to run the business for 9 years between the death of her husband in 1669 and her own death in 1678. She took on 2 apprentices registered to the Fishmongers' Company, so that was the kind of formal company her husband was registered with, despite the fact he wasn't, by all appearances, at any point in his life working as a fishmonger. And obviously she had the right to take on those apprentices. The city custom allowed widows to continue running their spouse's business after they died. So she took on Isaac Harper as an apprentice in 1673, and then Mary Ireland in 1676. Really interestingly, her probate inventory and her will show that the apprentices were part of a network of interconnected friends and kin. So Isaac Harper was the son of Isaac Harpick the elder and his wife Martha, and Martha was actually Prudence's younger sister. She actually bequeathed her sister and her brother-in-law £10 in her will. Similarly, she referred to Mr. Ireland and his wife, my maid's father and mother, as her loving friends in her will, bequeathing each of them 20 shillings. So inventory also shows that she owed £13, 18 shillings to Mr. Ireland for Thomas Wood's board and schooling. So Thomas Wood's her youngest son, meaning that she not only took on the daughter of her friend as an apprentice, but she also entrusted the education of her youngest son to him. The number of debts owing to her in her inventory also suggests she continued the business in a similar manner to her husband. She had over £6,000 owing to her from dozens of different people when she died, which obviously for this period is quite a considerable sum of money, many of which were secured by bond and some of which had only been partially paid. Some of this was very likely shop credit. Obviously, the economy is doing much more business than the kind of currency you can keep up with in this period, so a lot of business is being done on kind of delayed credit. And certainly, obviously, she was doing wholesale trade with other cities by the sounds of it as well. And also some of it might have been from money lending as well. It's quite common for women and widows in this period to kind of lend money on interest to kind of generate extra income for the household. Indeed, she even expressed a desire to see the business continue after her own death. In her will, she stated that it is my will and desire that my said daughter Anne Wood, I think is one of her younger daughters, Anne Wood may afterwards manage and carry on my trade, which will be a great addition to her portion and fortune. So Anne Wood would have already been left money by her father and then by Prudence subsequently, but she also wanted her to leave the business to her as well. So Prudence Wood's 3 oldest children, Prudence, Judith and Elizabeth, had all married during her time as a widow, and she clearly wanted to ensure the financial security of her remaining daughter and sought to do this by passing on the business. She also used her will to provide for her other children. She charged her executors to ensure that the interest from the inheritance of her oldest son and 5th child, Edward Wood, was also used to place him out as an apprentice with a considerable merchant in London, which I think that nice choice of words shows that she thought of herself as quite a considerable merchant family and wanted to ensure that her son was apprenticed to someone of kind of equal status. She instructed the same for her youngest child, Thomas Wood, the one who'd been at school with Mr. Ireland, and left various sums of money to her 3 married daughters and their spouses. As with her apprentices, she had professional as well as personal links with her sons-in-law. So she owed a debt of £7, 6p to Aaron Smith, the husband of her oldest daughter, Prudence, for law business, which suggests he was probably a clerk or a lawyer and she'd done business with him before. Similarly, she owned John Collier, the husband of her second daughter Judith, £108 on bond, suggesting that she had at some point before her death borrowed a substantial sum of money from him. So Prudence Wood's inventory is rich in detail about her life, and when used in conjunction with her will, we can learn a great deal about the business that she was involved in, as long as her finances and her personal and professional relationships. During her 9 years as a widow, Prudence Wood was also able to continue the family's millinery business, take on some apprentices, and amass a large fortune that she was able to bequeath to several of her apprentices, friends, and family. She was able to do all of this alongside the administration of her husband's estate and overseeing the marriage of her three eldest daughters in what could be a precarious stage of life for women. So that's Prudence Wood. The next one I'm going to talk about is Mary Kellett. I have to confess I've been quite lazy by not putting the birth and death dates. She had so many children, and putting all of those in little text boxes was going to take far too long, so I have omitted those. So Mary Kellett was born Mary Leake. She married the vintner, so someone who sells wine, in 1695, and the couple went on to have 8 children before Henry Kellett died in 1711. Very productive marriage. Henry Kellett's will was proved on the 12th of June 1711 at the Prerogative Court of Canterbury. So there are all the wills that are held over at the National Archives, and which you can see on Ancestry. He was named as his sole executor and also the guardian to the couple's children. An inventory of his estate was drawn up just over a week later on the 20th of June 1711, so very, very quick administration. And Mary Kellett brought his inventory to the Court of Orphans a few months later in September of the same year. She returned to Guildhall again in November of 1711 to enter into a recognizance to hold the £621 inheritance owed to her orphans, with her kinsman Richard Leake acting as the surety. So unlike Thomas Wood, Henry Kellett's trade was closely linked to his guild membership, as his inventory includes several drinking rooms, a bar and a cellar with £1,300 worth of wine, which again is an incredibly large sum of money, especially to have just purely in stock for a business. The address that Mary Kellett gave to the Court of Orphans shortly after her husband's death is listed as Ship Tavern behind the Exchange, which is the site of where the Bank of England now is. But at the time, the Bank of England obviously didn't exist. Well, no, actually at this point it does exist, but it was across the road. So this was very likely the tavern the couple were running when Henry Kellett died. Mary Kellett continued running the tavern during her 3 years as a widow, as the same property is listed on her own probate inventory from August 1714. The wine in the cellars of the tavern was also worth £400 more when Mary Kellett died than when her husband's inventory had been drawn up 3 years previously, and it had 134 hogsheads valued at £1,736. It was clearly a large business, and the Kelletts had help running the tavern. So Henry Kellett's inventory shows they had 2 live-in drawers, so they served drinks to customers, and they were actually living in the 2 garret rooms, the attic rooms at the top of their property. And Mary Kellett must have taken on an extra employee during her widowhood, so after her husband died, as her inventory lists 3 drawing lodging rooms in the attic. She also took on 2 apprentices the year before she died in 1713, and one of them may have been the extra drawer in her inventory. The first was her eldest son, also named Henry Kellett, and the second, James Haight from Covent Garden, where she was also from. So it could potentially have been a relative or a neighbour. Like Prudence Wood, Mary Kellett was responsible for the administration of her husband's estate and visited the court several times in the months following his death. As head of the family after her husband had passed away, she also continued the family's trade, managing the tavern and its stock, overseeing at least 3 apprentices or workers who helped in the business, as well as at least 1 domestic servant, all while caring for the orphans still at home in the family's nursery, which is one of the rooms actually listed on her probate inventory. That she took on her son as an apprentice as opposed to putting him out to apprentice with another merchant suggests that, like Prudence Wood, she also wanted to ensure that the business continued to benefit the family. The couple were also in receipt of money for a property referred to in both their inventories as Mr. Leake's. Mary Kellett's father, Ralph Leake, owed her £430 principal money for a mortgage, suggesting they had previously conveyed the property to him, for which they were still receiving payment. In fact, Mary Kellett had a large amount of money owing to her, including the repayments of money she had lent on principal and interest, secured by bond and notes, so two different types of security. She also had 2 lottery tickets worth £200, as well as, quite sort of weirdly, 3 Dutch lottery tickets, which her executors put a little note at the bottom of her inventory saying that they were unwilling to try and claim the money because of their uncertain nature. In total, she had nearly £4,000 owing to her in both good and bad debts, including from at least 4 of her own kin. She was not just lending money out, but also borrowing it, as well as trading on credit. She owed money borrowed on principal and interest, small sums to a cooper, woodmonger and grocer, and money for parish duties and for wages. Listed last is the £621 that she'd borrowed from the city's chamber 3 years previously, allowing her to use the orphans' inheritance money. So coming back to that sort of flowchart I had before, she'd obviously made the decision to kind of hold that money, and it allowed her to use that. I can't quite see what she was using it for. It could be that she was putting it into the business and then taking that money back out at a later stage. She could have just been holding it because she felt it was more secure if she held it herself, rather than putting it in the chamber. It's really hard to see what they were using the money for, but interesting that she made the decision to hold the money. Her success as a businesswoman is evidenced by the £1,185 that she was able to leave her orphans on top of the money left to them by their father. So not only were they owed the £600 and odd their father had left them, but also nearly £1,200 left by her as well. Following their mother's death sometime in 1713 or 14, the 8 Kellett orphans were parentless, and all of them were under the age of 21. So again, it really highlights sort of how tumultuous the life cycle could be, that you lose a mother and a father within a couple of years and having to go through the administration of the court twice in those couple of years. Their guardianship appears to have passed to their mother's brother, John Leake. So Henry Kellett Jr. did not continue as a vintner, the apprenticeship that his mother had taken him on as. And along with his younger brother, Ralph Kellett, they went on to become factors in the East India Company in Bombay, where they both married in the 18th century. Elizabeth Kellett was apprenticed to a mistress in the Grocers' Company in 1715, and Martha Kellett was apprenticed to a mistress milliner in 1723, so sort of staying in the family business. They both went on to have their own links to the East India Company. So Elizabeth's husband or son went on to become a writer in the company. These are all sort of ranks within the East India Company. And Martha Kellett married Stephen Law, who was the governor of Bombay from 1739 to 1742. The eldest orphan, Mary Kellett, also went on to marry, and her son John Cartier followed his family into the East India Company, becoming the governor of Bengal in 1769. As with many children born to London's merchant class in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Kellett orphans were at the forefront of Britain's colonial expansion throughout the 18th century. Mary Kellett's inventory allows us an insight into her economic and social life as a mother, a business owner, and financial manager. She dealt with the administration of her husband's estate, managed and expanded the family's business, and used her children's inheritance as a source of capital during their minority. Not only was she able to pay this back to the Chamberlain, so the Chamberlain of the City of London, but also leave an additional substantial sum to her children. Though she died before any of her children reached adulthood, their socially mobile marriages and careers demonstrates the importance of women as guardians and financial managers, securing the futures of the city's orphans. Moving beyond the court, Mary Kellett and her daughters demonstrate the importance of women in the city's guilds as mistresses, taking on apprentices after their spouses had died, as well as the increasing number of women apprentices in the city's livery companies. Kellett also demonstrates how women formed key familial links in the network of business owners and merchants connected with the East India Company. I think this is a slightly under-researched area about the kind of importance of people that would go on to have successful careers and kind of Britain's colonial efforts in the 18th century and their kind of childhood and formative years in the City of London, working in these very kind of business households. So the final working widow that I want to discuss today is Edith Stanton. I should also say for that last one, I came up with the title of this being in the 17th century before I wrote the paper, and decided to include Mary Kellett, who's very clearly in the 18th century, because her life is so interesting. So I've slightly gone beyond the sort of title of my paper here. But so the final widow is Edith Stanton. So Edith had married Thomas Gillingham, a glover, in 1656, and they had 3 children. Andrew, Elizabeth and Thomas. Thomas the Elder died in 1676, and just over 6 months later, Edith married again to Richard Stanton, a merchant tailor. So we know the orphans' portion was deposited in the city's chamber as both Edith and Richard Stanton came to the Guildhall together in June 1679 to deposit £100 towards the children's inheritance. After this, Edith appears to have left the management of her orphans' inheritance to her second husband, as Richard came to the Guildhall, this time on his own, to deposit another £100 into the chamber in May, and then again in July 1680. As initial money was deposited in the chamber, obviously parents, mothers, second husbands could then choose to bring further money and deposit that. Obviously, the more money you put into the chamber, the more interest that would accrue, and obviously the more interest you could claim over the course of the orphan's lifetime. The youngest Gillingham child, Thomas, is not mentioned in any of these references, so it appears that he might have died only a few years after his father. Incidentally, there were many reasons that a widow chose to either remain single or to remarry in this period. It's far too kind of numerous to go into lots of detail here. But it's perhaps important to note that when she remarried, Edith was still running her first husband's glove-making business. She took on 2 female apprentices in 1678 and 1679 as a member of the Glovers' Company, which is the company of her first husband, suggesting that the business was somewhat successful. From a purely pragmatic perspective, remarrying provided security, but also helped with the labour of running a business and dealing with the administrative obligations in the court. Obviously, I'm making conjecture here, also no idea why she married for a second time, but I think it is important to remember that she was running a business, and her husband was also running a second husband, was also running a fairly successful business as well. So could be alliances between businesses, could be within the network, within the community, things like that. So just a few years after the Gillingham orphans, money was deposited in the city's chamber. The City of London fell into a financial crisis that was to last for over a decade. So in fact, by the 1680s, the city had been struggling financially for nearly half a century. The reasons for the city's financial crisis between 1683 and 1694 are lengthy and still sort of quite hotly debated. But it was certainly exacerbated by the city's failure to modernise its taxation system and also the Great Fire of London. There's a lot of debate at the time. The city was very quick to blame lots of other people other than themselves. So they were blaming it was a civil war, it was King Charles coming back that was really expensive for us, it was losing the Quo Warranto. I think general debate now seems to kind of fixate quite squarely on the Great Fire and the amount of money it cost the city to rehouse people, rebuild, things like that. But also its taxation system. The city's population within the walls was the only population being taxed, but it was actually subsidising the population that was growing quite rapidly outside the walls. So it was taxing a much smaller population than it was actually providing for. The issue with this was that during this period of the financial failure, when it was unable to pay any of its debts for that 11 years, or not very many of them anyway, nearly all the orphan portions deposited in the chamber were also lost. So there was just one big pit of money, and when all that money was gone, it kind of wasn't separated in kind of modern financial accounting that we do now. But what's this financial failure got to do with the Gillingham estate and Edith Stanton? So as the Gillingham orphans' portions were deposited in the city's chamber between 1679 and 1680, their portions were still under the city's control in the wake of the city's financial failure in 83. Meaning they were unable to access their portions when they reached maturity at the end of the 1680s. We know this because Edith Stanton was one of the prominent figures in the orphan lobby. So as this kind of debate and sort of crisis rages on, obviously there's increasing different parties getting frustrated, the city's getting quite defensive of the reason it's got no money, and obviously you have this large portion of orphans and other people that have money deposited in the city's chamber getting quite frustrated. They can't claim any of it back. So the large group of orphans and their mothers, the widows, are referred to as the orphan lobby, and they were responsible for petitioning quite a lot to encourage the sort of central government and London to kind of reach a settlement. So this petition here is, I'm cheating a little bit because this is not from TLA, this is from the Parliamentary Archives, and this is one of the House of Lords petitions. So this is a petition to the House of Lords trying to really encourage them to sort of step in and help the city out of this financial crisis. And there's a list of signatures here, so these are all women's signatures and these are all men's signatures. And Edith Stanton's signature is this one here. It's spelled Eadeth. I had to put that on Twitter to get someone to help me figure out what that says because I couldn't figure out the paleography. And even in the parliamentary publications where they transcribed all of this, her name is also blank. So Twitter was a great resource for finding out people's names. So yeah, Edith was quite a prominent person within this orphan lobby. She was responsible for petitioning the city and Parliament to push for a financial settlement. So this petition's from 1691 and shows her signature alongside 5 other women and 5 men. So Edith and the other signees stated in the petition that it was on behalf of the 1,400 orphans, and they implored the Lords not to suffer them to perish for want of their respective portions. So again, just trying to remind them that there are lots of orphans that are unable to kind of claim any of this money, money that's often really essential in this period to go on and pay for an apprenticeship, to pay for a settlement to go into marriage, set you up in trade, all these kind of things. So there were numerous petitions and even a demonstration by a group of what the city called clamorous widows, who were sort of in the Guildhall throughout the course of the city's financial crisis in the 1680s and 90s. And it's possible that Edith may have been among one of these clamorous widows, not kind of just signing petitions. What we can confirm, though, is that at the age of 62, Edith was involved in the orphan lobby signing petitions to reach a financial settlement that would see her 2 orphans allowed to withdraw their portions from the city's chamber. Edith appears in the Court of Orphans again in November 1694, so this is 6 months after the Act has been passed. So the Act for the Relief of the Orphans was a large act that was passed, I think it's in March 1694, and that set up a quite complicated way that the city could kind of come back from its financial failure. So it was a combination of investing money in coal, which seemed fairly risky at this point, but obviously, as you can imagine, goes on to become quite lucrative throughout the 18th century, and also taxing some of these citizens as well. So if anyone's been through any of the parish records, you'll often see notes to paying for the Orphan Act. So yeah, she comes to the court in November, so later in that year after the Act for the Relief of the Orphans has been passed, this time with her son Andrew, swearing that he was above the age of 21, allowing him to acknowledge satisfaction, claim his money, and then leave the court's jurisdiction. So her son-in-law, Thomas McCulloch, so he's married to Elizabeth, her daughter. He also came to the court a few days later to collect his wife's portion, 7 years after Elizabeth had actually reached maturity. So Elizabeth had reached maturity 1687, so sort of during while this crisis is going on. Is that right? Maths, yeah. So yeah, she'd had to wait a considerable amount of time to then be able to actually collect her inheritance. The last revealing insight we have into Edith's involvement in her children's inheritance is a note in her will from 1701, in which she states that she had £200 orphan money in the chamber, which she bought off her son Andrew, which she bequeathed to her daughter Elizabeth. So from this, it seems likely to assume that Edith actually advanced her son his money. So during the financial crisis, he's unable to claim it. She may have taken her own money, advanced that to her son, and then when the Act gets passed, she then comes in, takes the money on his behalf, but it might actually be owed to her because she's kind of lent the money ahead of time to her son. So yeah, it seems like she advanced her son his money in the chamber from her own pocket while the financial crisis was going on, and he was unable to claim it. She must then have kept the investment in the chamber and left it there until she died in 1701. This is not the only instance of these women advancing portions to their children during the city's financial crisis, and it highlights the financial burdens that fell on women who are responsible for the maintenance of their children. You often see this also in where the father has passed away and left a lot of money to his children, but actually a lot of that money is wrapped up in property. Obviously, the children are then unable to take that money. Widows were often advancing their children that money and leaving the property because it was a good investment, and then kind of selling that property much later down the line. Advancing an orphan their inheritance allowed them to enter into an apprenticeship, set up a trade, or prepare for marriage, which they were otherwise unable to do. Edith not only involved herself in petitioning and lobbying to push for a financial settlement that would allow her orphans to claim their inheritances. I'll come back in a second. But she also used her own finances to offset the loss of her son's investment in the city's chamber. So hopefully these examples have shown the complicated and multifaceted nature of widows' lives in this period and the variety of work they were involved in. I think I've used the sort of word work quite loosely to kind of show all different types of work, whether it's running a business, kind of unpaid domestic labour within the household, but also just the administrative work that kind of came with being a widow in this period. So they're managing money, running a business, taking on apprentices, or litigating on behalf of their children. Their lives were incredibly complex, and they managed a range of different labour activities in what could be a very precarious stage of the life cycle. So I don't really have any kind of grand conclusions in any of this. I just wanted to take this opportunity to kind of look at the three lives of these women and what I've been able to pull out of some of the records in the archives that we've got here. This obviously is the Guildhall in the City of London where the court was administered. And this is a box of probate inventory. So there's inventories that I was talking about before where all of the property was kind of listed, written on vellum, and then they were rolled into these bundles. And there's about 70 boxes of these bundles that survive. There's 3,300 and something in total, I think. Most of them are men's, but about 90 to 100 of them belong to women. So a lot of the research that I did was using all of those 100 women's probate inventories. And then at the very end of this, I've just put some resources. So yeah, a lot of the baptism, marriage and burial records I used during this research from the records that we've got here that were digitised and put on Ancestry. And also the Freedom of the City of Mission papers. So they're all the kind of entries to the freedom, and I relied on those quite heavily. Also Rollco that I was talking about before. So these are the livery companies that are not kept by Guildhall or by us here, but are actually kept by the individual livery companies because they have their own archivists. They've got some of their freedoms, apprenticeship records on Rollco. And this is the research guide to the Court of Orphans, and this is the reference code if anyone's interested in looking at any of the Court of Orphans material. But yeah, that's it. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What do you think are the links between the financial crisis, the passing of the Act on behalf of orphans, and the founding of the Bank of England?
Jess, would it be okay to repeat that?
Yes. So the question was about the links between the city's financial failure, the passing of the Act in 1694, and then the founding of the Bank of England in the same year. It's a really, really good question. I talked about it a little bit in my conclusion because I think I had some ideas, but again, the research probably needs to be done. I think the really important thing is that the city had quite a good reputation for managing money until the financial crisis. There was never a reason to suggest that the city was not good at managing money. It offered one of the only kind of safe and actually quite high interest rate. I think it's about 4 or 5% at this period. So it was quite a good, wise place to sort of put your money. Obviously that changes quite quickly and the city's financial failure comes as quite a surprise to the city, whereas if you're actually looking at its account books, you can see it's happening really slowly over a long period of time, but for some reason it did sort of shock the city. It just defaulted on its debts and then all of a sudden was like, oh goodness. Obviously it raged on for so long and I think it really undermined sort of trust in the city as a sort of financial institution. I think there's a lot of links between that and the Bank of England. Obviously the Bank of England is founded for quite separate reasons. Obviously it's founded largely, I think, to help fund the government in kind of wars that were going on at the time. But I think the court after 1694 starts to decline a little bit because they take away the sort of financial need that you have to put the money in. So that kind of financial need kind of goes away. And also the city changed its customs in 1725, which means you don't have to kind of have anything to do with the court if you don't want to. So it's very much that as the Bank of England kind of comes up, the court does start to decline. And I think there's definitely a link there, if for nothing else other than the Bank of England provided another more secure place to put your money that wasn't the city's chamber, which obviously at this point has got a fairly bad reputation for not managing money. So there's quite a lot of links, and I think if I'd love for someone else to do this research so I can read it, which is to actually go through the sort of first investors in the Bank of England and from the 1694 through to the sort of very early 1700s and actually see if you can find any sort of overlaps between the Court of Orphans and the Bank of England, because there probably are some overlaps. Some of them did have Bank of England stock, so there's definitely some overlaps there. So if anyone wants to do that research, please do it so I can read it. I just don't want to do it myself.
Cheers, thank you.
Is there any evidence that these widows had been involved in their husband's business before they became widows?
Yeah, that's really tricky, and I think it's Sorry, yeah, the question, sorry. It's the question about whether, how much evidence we've got for these women being involved in the husband's business before they died, kind of not just after. It's really frustrating, I think, because you can kind of see it through sort of the gaps, but it's really hard to get a tangible kind of note on it. Obviously, if the husband is alive, the apprentices were all in his name. The probate inventory is only for him when he died. So I think it's trying to read around the kind of subject matter and the training that some of these women had. So often the ones that were going into apprentices were then kind of marrying merchants later in life. And I think them going into apprentices was kind of that training of, becoming literate, kind of getting a good idea of the finances of the household. So then they could then go on and marry a merchant and kind of provide that labour within the house. I think, if we take someone like Mary Kellett, for example, who, her husband's running quite a complicated business. It's a pub with multiple different rooms in it, obviously a large amount of stock in the cellar, managing at least 3 employees as well. It's kind of a gut feeling that there's no way they had nothing to do with that business at all, and then suddenly their husbands died and they were just really able to quickly just pick all that up and then carry on. So I think it's an assumption, and I think also when you start looking at their own inventories as well, the kind of different types of jobs they've got, I think a lot of them were just cobbling together loads of different types of income generation. So some of them were making money off being doing people's laundry. Some of them were just sort of lending out money on principal and interest. They were kind of lending it 100 quid and asking for 105 quid back. There's one woman I looked at who must have been one of the biggest landlords, sort of citizen landlords in the period. She owns so much property and she's making so much money off that as well. So I think even if they weren't directly involved in their husband's business, they had their own sort of businesses that they were kind of running separately. And the city is quite unique in that women do have more rights in the city in this period than they do in the rest of the country, because they are able to trade as femme soles, so they can actually run their own businesses separate from their husband, and they can actually be sued in court separate from their husband, whereas in the rest of the country, you couldn't sue a wife, you had to sue the husband. So the city does allow for kind of that separation of business, but yeah, I think if they were running it after he died, there's a very good chance they were at least semi-involved in it, even if they were doing the books or something beforehand. But even if they weren't, and they were, you can tell there's no overlap. They had a lot of them had their own sort of fingers and lots of pies to kind of generate income. If that answers your question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions? I'll just give the people at home a chance, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah.
I'm just interested to know what drew you to the topic.
Mm.
How did you land on this?
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one. I was, sorry, yes, man like me every time. So the question is how I kind of got into doing this research and how I came across the topic. I was doing a master's degree in early modern history, so kind of, related to this. And I was trying to write an essay, and I was trying to look for sources that I could use online, and I came across the Old Bailey proceedings, which are obviously largely online. And they do go back to the sort of, I think some of them are from the 1690, I think are the earliest ones on there. And I don't ask me how, but I ended up doing an essay on infanticide in the late 17th century. So the 1670s, 80s and 90s, I think, and just kind of how infanticide was sort of tried and how it was defined in the time. It's a much different definition to now. And then I think as part of that, I started looking largely at not just infanticide, but like child abandonment and things like that. So the sort of care that parishes provided for foundling children, obviously the founding of the Foundling Hospital in 1730s. And then, obviously I came across the Court of Orphans as a kind of separate civic institution that's providing for orphans in a kind of different way. And I think someone, who then became my PhD supervisor, just made a passing comment like, oh, this would be a good PhD topic. And I just sort of rooted at the back of my brain, and then,
That's how they get you.
Yeah, it's how they get you, exactly, yeah. It's like a pyramid scheme. So that's how I ended up. I just came back to the Court of Orphans. I did my master's dissertation on the inventories. So I was making sort of desperate dashes down here on Wednesdays when we're open until 7 to just photograph as many inventories as possible. And then, I used those for my master's dissertation. And then, kind of sort of expanded it and did a much broader look at kind of women's involvement in the court through all the different stages for my PhD. But the master's is pretty dreadful. So, it's much better now.
a question?